Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith.
Here we are.
Yeah, Brian, you're back. You're on the road today.
It's Bistro on the road today, so.
Bistro on the road today. You're sabbaticaling, and you're on the road. You're in Louisville, Lexington? Where are you at?
Lexington, yeah.
Very good.
In the bluegrass. I'm here where all the horses are, where the horses are beautiful and the women are fast. No, you better cut that out.
No, I'm absolutely not cutting that out. That's fantastic. That's good stuff right there.
Okay.
Well, we're back. So a good day in the bistro. You know, we're gonna focus on Bible stuff today. There's nothing else going on in the world that we need to talk about or think about.
It's crazy, right?
Oh my goodness. Well, you can always count on the bistro to be sure and steady. We're just going to talk about these things. Talk about the Bible. Well, we're here today. What?
Sorry, I keep losing my earphone. Go ahead.
That's all right. Well, we're here. We're going to talk about something that's this is always a fun conversation, especially as you read the book of Hebrews. It always comes up. Everybody's like, what?
What's going on here?
Yeah. So talk to us, Brian.
Well, it's so Genesis 14 is an interesting part of the book of Genesis. There's a Old Testament scholar I follow all the time. He's a Restoration Movement guy, James Smith. He wrote on the entire Old Testament, but his book on the Pentateuch is really excellent. Anytime I'm looking at Genesis or anything, I always go there. We used it during the Leviticus series, if you guys remember the very highly acclaimed Leviticus series.
Yeah.
But he says this is a quote from him. Genesis 14 records the most unusual incident in the life of Abraham. Now that's really saying something because you've got a lot going on in the life of Abraham.
Abraham's got some weird stuff in there, yeah.
So I kind of want to get us up to chapter 14 and remind you of what happened before this. The end of chapter 11 is when we're introduced to Abraham and his family, really his father and his lineage. Chapter 12, God calls Abraham specifically and says, we're going to go to this land that I'm going to show you. I'm going to use your family in order to be a blessing to all families. I'm going to make you a great nation. So that's chapter 12. The end of chapter. So we always talk about Abraham is a example of our faith, right? And even Paul says he is the father of all who believe. Father of faith, we call him. But then by the end of chapter 12, we find Abraham not acting out of faith, but out of fear. Initially, he acts out of faith. He leaves the place where he is. He goes to a place he's never been that God is showing him to go. End of chapter 12, though, he's lying about his wife because he's afraid of how he's going to be treated in Egypt. He goes down there because of the famine. Which I even think that shows a lack of trust. You know, he's not trusting God to provide for him. He goes down to Egypt, take care of things himself. He lies about it because he's afraid that they're going to take his wife, Sarah. And so that's the end of chapter 12. 13, then, we get this occasion where we find out Lot, who is Abraham's nephew, has been traveling with him, and they're at a point they need to divide. And so Lot goes down into the cities of the plain, which are called Sodom and Gomorrah, and of course they become famous later on, right? Not at this point. Yes. He should have known they were called Sodom and Gomorrah, right? But then Abraham goes the other direction. He goes up and settles on the east side of the Dead Sea. Technically the Sea of Galilee, up in that area. Mamre is where he is, and so. I guess it is the Dead Sea, Hebron in that area, but that's where he settles. And so then chapter 14 is really a story of a military campaign. So it has a whole different character. It's not different than other documents we have from this period of time. It's not different than other military campaigns, but we don't get a lot in the Bible that are just strictly, let me recount this military campaign with all the names and all the places and all the things that are going on. So that's what chapter 14 begins with. Let's go ahead and read just verses 5 through 11 because we see this, and it kind of explains why it is that Abraham gets involved in this. And, you always say, I'm trying to make you look dumb in this podcast, which is not true at all. If I was wanting to make you look dumb, I would have you read this. But I'm going to make myself look dumb instead. because there are lots of
Well,
names.
these are very common names. I don't know how you could mess them up.
Okay. Well, let me see what I can do. So starting in verse 5, it says, in the 14th year, Kedorlaomer, and I practiced this, believe it or not, and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephaites in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Shavah Kiriathaim, and the and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran near the desert. Then they turned back and went to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites as well as the Amorites who were living in Hazazon Tamar. Now, I'll go ahead and kind of summarize what's going on here. In the first 4 verses, by the way, of this chapter I didn't read, kind of summarizes all this. Basically, there are these 4 kings who rebel against their overlord and begin this series of conquering different nations, city-states, really. It's not necessarily huge nations, but city-states down along the east side of the Sea of the Dead Sea. And they have a great deal of success. They don't initially attack Sodom and Gomorrah, but they're going to turn back and attack them. That's what happens here. This is verse 8. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. So what happens is these 4 kings that rebelled are now turning back toward these cities on the plain, including Sodom and Gomorrah. So 5 of these kings and their cities draw up to defend themselves. And what happens is instead they become defeated. It says in verse 10, now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled into the hills. The 4 kings, that is those 4 that were coming down from the north, seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, all their food, then they went away. So they were able to become, these 4 kings were able to defeat the 5 kings of the city of the plain in defending it. They took all their goods. And then why don't you read verse 12, because this is really what involves Abraham in this whole mess.
Yeah. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot, and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom.
So Lot becomes one of the prisoners taken by these, and probably a man of standing. They were taking his stuff and him. Not an unusual thing to happen in warfare during this period of time. So is that clear? Do you understand where we are so far and what's going on?
There's a war that's happened, that Lot's there. He's in Sodom. The kings come down. They get defeated. And because the 4 kings are carrying off all the loot and the highborn people, or, the things that are valuable, carrying them off. And Lot was one of them. Okay.
So what happens is Abram, and again, he's on the west side of the Dead Sea here, a man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. This is in verse 13. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative, that is Lot, had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, let me stop there for just a minute. 318 trained men within Abram's household. One of the things that I think that this passage shows us, and we often ignore, and I'll go ahead and tell you, we skip down to the end of this. And I know everybody, even if you've started reading through the Bible, you got to at least Genesis 14. But you probably got this list of names, and you're like, oh, blah, 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 blah. But everybody gets down to the last part, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? Which that's not a new thing. That's been going on, as we're going to see, for 1,000 years. But what happens here is this shows us something about Abram standing in the community. Now, you remember that he calls himself a stranger in a strange land, right? I'm a nomad in this land that God has shown me. I'm not a native born. So he's living here among another kind of people. But God has clearly blessed him, because he has increased his standing. So he has 318 trained military people born within his household. It shows us something about the increase in his wealth. It shows us something about the increase in his standing, that he's able to respond in the way that he does.
Hmm.
So they go in pursuit of these people because of Lot being taken captive. Verse 15: During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. So a couple of really interesting things. Not only had God blessed him in terms of wealth, but it becomes clear that Abram and his allies, and there are some other people here we're going to find out that are allied with him in this pursuit, they're able to do something that these powerful kings of the cities of the plains are not able to do. Right?
Right.
They're able to rout this army when the cities on the plain were not even able to defend their own cities against them. And well, the reason for this, the Bible is going to be clear about this, and it's part of this really weird kind of thing that happens at the end of this chapter. The Bible is clear about this, that the reason they were successful was God had blessed them. God was able to give them the victory when the kings of the plains were not able to be successful. So, thoughts on this so far? Anything you notice? Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I had never thought about that, but the him having 318 trained fighting men in his household,
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
it was, he was kind of prepared for, I mean, a little bit of, I mean, he was prepared for the fact that, I always thought, again, when I think of nomad, I think of him with just this flocks and,
Sure.
there's family there, but not 318 trained men.
Right.
And I'm assuming they're trained for combat then, you know what I
Right.
mean? Like
Well,
he's got himself a little state here of sorts.
it's true, and so yeah. So you think about this nomads. I'm trying to think. It's very outside of our own experience, right? But I'm thinking about there are places in the world, and I'm not going to name any again because we don't want to get in trouble here. But there are places in the world. If you had this much wealth, you would have bodyguards. Even today, I'm saying.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying? You would have to have people watching your property all the time. And so it's the same with these flocks and herds. You have to have people who are. So I think that's what they're not necessarily trained for combat in the sense of being armies, right? They're more trained, I think, to guard the possessions, to be the ones who are taking care of things, making sure that Abraham doesn't lose his possessions is what it comes down to. The 318 trained men as well. It indicates that he's going to have even a larger number of servants in his household. And again, in this period of time, that's one of the ways that you measure a person's standing in their wealth, not only the flocks and herds, but also the servants that they have, basically people that they can command to do their will. And so I think this again shows us that Abraham's standing has increased in the land greatly. So,
Okay.
now what this does is this sets up a meeting with two different figures. One of them is a king of Sodom, and the other is a king of Salem. And I think that these two, I really think this is kind of the point of this whole story, is to set these two up and to prepare us for what's going to come later as well. So the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. And I'm going to let you, do you ever have a choose your own adventure book, Ryan?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. We're going to play choose your own adventure. Who do you want to talk about the encounter with first, the king of Salem or the king of Sodom? Which do you want to talk about first? You choose.
We're going to talk about both of them, though, but I get to choose
We're going
which
to
one
talk
we
about
talk about.
both of them.
Okay. Let's do Sodom. Why not?
Okay, let's talk about the king of Sodom first. So turn to verse 21 then in your Choose Your Own Adventure book. So this is chapter 14, verse 21.
Yes, the Choose Your Own Adventure book, also known as
The Bible. Which, I mean, kind of works. So here's the king of Sodom. Now again, remember the king of Sodom had been defeated by these same people that Abraham was then able to recover this material from. So the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." It's a very terse response here. It's very interesting. It's only 6 words, I think, in Hebrew, if I remember correctly. Give me the people, keep the goods for yourself. Basically, there's no thank you. Thank you for recovering my loot, right?
Yeah.
But basically, bring my people back. You can keep the loot. But Abram said to the king of Sodom with raised hand. So this is a way to swear, right? With raised hand, I have sworn an oath to the Lord, Yahweh Most High, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap or a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me, to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. These are the allies that we were talking about earlier that went up with Abram. Let them have their share. So it's an interesting little interaction here that Abram has with the king of Sodom. Again, the king of Sodom, Abram's done him a favor, but it's almost like you could hear him kind of basically being very, how do I say this, belligerent about it. Like, and I think there's probably some embarrassment here. Abram, this nomad, was able to do what he couldn't do in defending his own city. He was able to defeat these kings. And so basically he says, you take your loot for yourself. I just want my people back. And Abram says, no, I've sworn to God, I'm not taking anything from you. And he says the reason is I don't want you to. You can kind of see the pride thing. I don't want, not on Abraham's part, but on the king of Sodom's part, that I don't want you claiming, oh, I'm the one who gave Abram his wealth, because he's the one who took the loot from my city after he defeated these kings. Abram wants it to be clear that the one who has blessed him and given him wealth is God Most High. That's the conflict that we see here. And this also kind of sets up what we're going to see later. I mentioned the name of Sodom and Gomorrah famous for us now, right? We know what happens later in the story. And already then this is kind of a foreshadowing that there is a conflict or a problem between God and the people of Sodom, right? God is not happy with the people of Sodom. Thoughts on this? Any comments or questions on that?
I don't know if I'd ever thought of it that way, that this was kind of a foreshadowing of the conflict between God and
the people of
Sodom. Yeah. I don't know if I'd ever thought of it that way. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, Abram is obviously setting up a distinction. Like, Abram's already rich,
right?
But it's kind of like, I think it is interesting that what Sodom wants is people, not stuff. Right. But I don't know. I'd never thought of it that way before. That this is kind of maybe a foreshadowing of potential conflict.
Maybe this will help. Remember, I said chapter 13 was where Lot and Abram kind of made their decision about where they were going to live. Let me go back to 13. This is verse 11. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, which is to the west, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. And then verse 13 of chapter 13 says, now the people of Sodom are wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So my point would be, this was not the first time in the narrative that you've come across the fact that there's a problem with this city. So again, yeah, maybe that would have been better if I'd set that up in that. So you kind of see now when he says, oh, I've sworn I'm not going to have anything to do with you, that there's already this kind of brewing sense of what's about to happen.
It wasn't about getting Sodom and their stuff back. It was about Lot. It was about getting Lot back, basically.
Exactly, his family taking because, and that's really, as I've said before, the whole story, this part of Genesis, is all about God's care for this family. When women are barren, He gives them children. When things are upset, he protects them. He saves them in miraculous ways. So that's really what this whole part of Genesis, really through the end, through Genesis chapter 50, is about, is this. Well, that was the king of Sodom. You chose well. I think that's the way I would wanted you to. We could do it either way, but I think this will be interesting then. So the other king that Abram meets with is one that we've heard of, and he is the king of Salem. This is the famous one. This is the one that captured everybody's attention. So why don't you go ahead and read chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. This is Abraham. So this happened before in the narrative, before the king of Sodom we just talked about. And I want you to notice while you read this, why don't you notice some of the contrast. This is an example in narrative where you set two similar accounts side by side, and you notice the things that are similar but the things that are different. So notice the contrast here.
Yeah. Then do you say Melchizedek or?
You can say it however you'd like to. I say Melchizedek, but
okay, Melchizedek, king of Salem.
I guess we would say, how would it be? Melchizedek, I guess, would be but anyway.
Okay, I'm not saying that. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand.
Go ahead and finish that
Oh,
verse.
then Abram gave him a tenth of everything.
That part of the verse is important because that's what gives rise to all the speculation about who this dude is.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you notice there? What's the difference between this and the interaction with the king of Sodom, would you say?
Well, Melchizedek is giving glory to God for what has been done. You know, it isn't about possessions.
He recognizes, again, the king of Sodom is kind of like, I think he's like, oh, Abram was able to do something I wasn't able to do. Melchizedek recognizes where that comes from. Mm-hmm. It's because God Most High has given you this victory. So yeah, he absolutely. So he knows something about who this God Most High is. This God Most High is the Elyon, is that the right one? But anyway, he's a priest of the God Most High here. What else do you notice? Anything else?
Well, that Abram gives him a tenth.
Yeah, which we'll talk about then later and what's going on.
And that he's a priest.
He's a priest. He's called a priest. There's some way in which he is interacting with God, but notice that the first thing he does is he offers a gift to Abraham. He brings out bread and wine, mm-hmm. and contrast this with the king of Sodom, who's kind of like, oh, just give me my people back, and it's very terse. Here, it's almost like a celebration, a thank you, right? Brings out mm-hmm. bread and wine. Basically this praise on behalf of Abraham, but also the God he serves is the difference here that I think. And then Abraham gives him a tenth. Now, in the context of this, what does it mean that Abram gave him a tenth, do you think? I'm talking about in Genesis 14.
Yeah. I mean, there is something to be offered to him for what has happened. Okay. You know what I mean? Like I mean, I think in this context, if he's a priest of God, I think Abram is recognizing that it is God who helped him accomplish this.
Here's what I'm going to say, and this may be a little controversial. We'll see how this goes over. If you just had this story and we never heard the name Melchizedek again, mm-hmm. then I think this is simply an account of, like all kinds of others that you read from this period of time, it's a battle that takes place. It's about the division of the loot among those who participated in the victory. Mm-hmm. And so the tenth that Abraham gives Melchizedek is somehow just a payment. Now, the idea that he is a priest and that this is the only, to this point in the scripture, this is the only mention that we have of this guy. And so that's where this whole idea that he comes from nowhere. It mentions that he's the king of Salem, which Salem, by the way, is later what we call Jerusalem. That's what becomes, when David says that's going to be the capital, that's that area of Salem where he is the king. So I think he's simply one of these guys that goes up with Abraham in order to rescue Lot. And Abram is giving him a portion of the spoils of what they retrieved, is how I understand this. Now,
so you're saying Melchizedek was one of his allies that went with him?
No, he was the king of Salem, just like these other guys were. Mm-hmm.
He's a king of an actual place,
a city-state, right?
Yeah.
So Melchizedek is mentioned only one other time in the Old Testament, and that's in Psalm 110. And Psalm 110 is an interesting psalm. I'm going to read at least the first part of the psalm for you. I guess I could have you read it.
Yeah.
So why don't you read just verse 1 first for us, first of all.
And Psalm 110.
Yeah. And this is Psalm of David. We'll go ahead and mention in the heading, this is Psalm of David.
Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Okay, so do you remember Jesus quoting this passage in the New Testament? Yes.
Okay, so and what he says is, how can David say this if David was referring to himself, right? He was talking about somebody else who was to come. And basically, he's saying David was not the Messiah. I am the Messiah, is what Jesus is saying here in this. He quotes Psalm 110. Now, go ahead and read down through the rest of Psalm 110.
Through verse 4?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, go ahead and read through verse 4. And
I can read the whole thing. Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, whatever.
And this is verse 2. The Yahweh will extend your mighty scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your troops will be willing on your day of battle, arrayed in holy splendor. Your young men will come to you like dew from the morning's womb. Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Yahweh is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath. He will judge the nations, heaping up the dead and crushing the rulers of the whole earth. He will drink from a brook along the way, so he will lift his head high.
So how would you summarize the message of Psalm 110? What would you say it's really kind of about, just from your initial reading of it? I know I didn't prepare you for this or anything.
God will give you the battle.
Okay, he's going to give you the victory, and a particular person. And Jesus later says, this is referring to me. That I'm going to be both the victor, the king, we can say, but then we also in the middle of this, and you can kind of understand why, because the account of Genesis 14 is about a victory in a battle.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about you are going to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Mm-hmm. And what this shows us is that Melchizedek had kind of captured the attention of some people. You know, here David mentions him. He's able to mention him like this in a way that people are going to just kind of understand who he is. But here's the crazy thing. These are the only two times that Melchizedek is mentioned in the Old Testament. It reminds me of another character we'll talk about a little bit later. But during the intertestamental period then, which we've talked about before, this character becomes the subject of a lot of speculation and a lot of attention gets paid to Melchizedek. And we see this. What other character do you think of like this? Can you think of other Old Testament characters like this that we've talked about before?
Enoch.
Enoch, the
Elijah.
Enoch is only mentioned once. Elijah, of course, is mentioned much more, but then he goes to heaven in a very unusual way. Mm-hmm. And so these characters become very people become fascinated with them during the intertestamental period. Mm-hmm. And so the book of Enoch, for example, first Enoch mentions Melchizedek quite a bit about his birth, and the book of First Enoch is always trying to fill in the details of the book of Genesis that Genesis doesn't tell us, right?
Right.
And so it tells us a lot about where Melchizedek comes from and all this kind of thing. And so he becomes kind of this, only mentioned twice in the Old Testament, becomes during the intertestamental period this really large figure in people's imaginations, right? As they think about what it means to relate to God, and they're thinking about all these things. Now, in the book of Hebrews, Melchizedek is mentioned 9 times. Okay? Yeah. So the Hebrew writer picks up on that kind of tradition, the same way we've talked about with Enoch in the past, when we see in 2 Peter, and we see in the book of Jude, this reference to Enoch. It's the same kind of thing with a Hebrew writer. He picks up on this speculation and all these stories that people are telling about Melchizedek, right, and using them to tell us about Jesus. Okay? Now, we're going to look at those passages in Hebrews. What they have caused some people to speculate about is that Melchizedek is some kind of appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. That it's not just a figure of speech, but this is actually Jesus incarnate in the Old Testament. And that may well be the case. Mm-hmm. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying when we read it at kind of its face value, that's not the way it's presented. Mm-hmm. But we need to notice a couple things. So look at Hebrews chapter 5, and let's see what we've got going on here. So Hebrews chapter 5, 6, and 7 is where all these 9 references are made. And how would you summarize, if you could very simply summarize the message of the book of Hebrews, how would you summarize the message of the book of Hebrews?
What is...
Nothing like putting you on the spot again, huh?
That Jesus is the fulfillment of everything from the Old Testament. He is Absolutely. The fulfillment of the line of the priests. He is God. Jesus is the fulfillment. Okay.
You said it very, very well. That's exactly what the Hebrew writer is saying. So you mentioned one particular, the priesthood, the high priest. Mm-hmm. What's the problem with Jesus being the high priest, though?
Well, he's not from the tribe of Levi.
He's from the tribe of Judah.
Mm-hmm.
And even more particularly, if he's going to be high priest, he needs to be not only from Aaron's line, but also Zerubbabel, right? And so what are we going to do with this? So this is what the Hebrew author is really trying to get across, in my opinion. So look at starting in verse 5. This is chapter 5, Hebrews chapter 5, verse 5. Mm-hmm. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. In other words, it's not something that he granted to himself. But God said to him, this is going to sound familiar, you are my son, and today I become your father. This is from Psalm 2. Mm-hmm. And he says in another place, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. What's he quoting there, do you think?
Psalm 110.
Psalm 110. So during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears. And basically he says he took that priesthood upon himself. And then verse 10, he was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So what the Hebrew writer is really trying to do here is to say there is a way that he is priest that is not because of his being from the line of Levi. That's the point I think that the Hebrew writer is trying to make. This has happened before. And he mentions, hey, here's this priest of the Lord Most High. He quotes the only other place that's mentioned in Psalm 110, which says God has made you a priest after the order of Melchizedek, and is saying that Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise. Okay, thoughts on that? Any questions or comments on that?
Not necessarily. I mean, I don't know if I have any, that he's the fulfillment of that. I don't know if I have any questions about that.
Right, okay. Well, now look down at verses 19 and 20 of chapter 6 then. We have this hope, talking about what God has done, in Jesus. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain. So that's talking about the most high place where the priest alone could go, the high priest, where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So it's that same reference he's making again. Chapter 7 then, verse 1, he begins to talk about who this Melchizedek is. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. That's the story from Genesis 14, right? And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. And so then the Hebrew writer begins to unpack this. He says, first, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. So you're asking me how to say this earlier. Melech is the Hebrew word for king. And you add an I to the end of that, and it becomes my king. The word Sedek means righteousness. So Melchizedek means my king of righteousness. So he says, first of all, he's the king of righteousness. Then also he's the king of Salem, which means the king of peace. You know the word shalom, right?
Right, yeah.
Or if you say this in Arabic, salam means peace. Both of those words mean peace. And so Salem comes from that same root, the SLM. In Hebrew, it's called a triliteral root. There's 3 consonants to it. And so it means king of peace. So and here's where we get into the mess then. So he's talking about, okay, he's king of righteousness, he's king of peace. And then it says this in verse 3, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. So if we take that literally, and there are people who do, what that's saying is that this Melchizedek wasn't born in the normal way and didn't have a genealogy, didn't live or die in the normal way. He's there kind of in a forever kind of place, if you take that in a literal sense. And this is where people say, oh, this is some kind of divine being, whether we understand it. And by the way, I should say in the intertestamental period, Melchizedek is seen as kind of an angel. Often, we've talked about Michael before, often compared to Michael the archangel, and sometimes even conflated with Michael the archangel. So if this is the way we understand this literally, then some people are saying this is Jesus, the Son of God incarnate. But that doesn't seem to be what the Hebrew writer is saying. I think what he's saying is, without genealogy means, if you read the book of Genesis,
there's genealogy of everybody.
most of your major characters, you know exactly where they come from, right?
Hmm.
This guy appears out of nowhere,
Hmm.
and we don't know anything about his background. Don't know who his father and mother are. Don't know where he comes from. Just the king of Salem, right? And so I think what the Hebrew writer's saying, this is my opinion, and again, there's people who disagree with me about nearly everything. My opinion is he's saying this one story that we have puts him in this kind of position where Abraham is giving him this tithe,
Hmm.
this tenth, and that's going to become important in just a minute, forever. So he's kind of just almost stands in this, how to say, it's timeless moment. We don't know anything about what happens to him after this. We don't know about anything that happened to him
Hmm.
before this. He's just in that moment forever. And so when Jesus, according to Psalm 10, if this is a reference to him, which Jesus refers to Psalm 10 as a reference to himself, then he's in this timeless kind of way. He is after the order of Melchizedek, he is a priest in that same way. So it seems like a strange argument to us. I always say this is kind of a rabbinic argument where he's saying, here's this Old Testament passage that we can grab hold of and show the way that Jesus can be understood as priest. Okay, thoughts on that? Any questions or comments? So do you understand the two different ways I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. This is always an interesting story for me. You know, when we
Yeah,
have these conversations without, I led a small group through this conversation. You know, like without father and mother. You know, I've read commentaries on this and that. It seems to be like Melchizedek is king of Salem. Like this is a physical place. Like it's
yep,
not like, you know, as we think about a theophany, if this is just a
right,
spiritual, you know, a spiritual being, you know, taking on flesh here. But it seems to be like there's, yeah, without genealogy, it's just like this is the only story that they have about him, which
yep.
is kind of why it kind of takes on a, I don't want to say it takes on a life of its own, as you kind of talked about this, but it's because it's
But it
like,
does. It really does.
where does this guy come from? We don't know, you know,
Right.
like we, you know, the patriarch Abraham brings this guy a tenth, and then we never hear another single thing
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, and
Um,
he's called priest of God Most High, right? And that's all we know about him. So
yeah.
yeah,
Well, you know, for me, the most interesting part of this story as we start thinking about it is he's a priest of God Most High, and we've never heard anything about them. And Abraham
right.
recognizes him as
Hmm.
this great priest. And I'm kind of going,
Yeah,
you know, for me, this always sparks the conversation. That means God's doing something else with other
yeah.
people that we don't know about. That's not written
Exactly.
about here.
That's another part of this. And there's even, well, I mean, he would be, I mean, technically everybody other than Abraham and his family are Gentiles at this point, right? But he's from a different genealogy than Abraham, right? He doesn't
Mm-hmm.
belong to his family. And like you said, God is being praised by him as well. And this Melchizedek has the insight to be able to see that he's the one who's given Abraham the victory, something the king of Sodom and the other kings apparently
Couldn't
didn't
see.
see, but he does see this. Later on, we get a story in Genesis. I should have done this too, where this is when Sarah dies, and Abram goes and he says, "I want to buy a piece of land um, so that Sarah can be buried here." And they're all like, "Oh, Abraham, mention whatever piece of land you want and we'll give it to you." And he's like, "No, no, 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 I want to buy it. I want to purchase it." And it becomes this big kind of deal. But again, it shows us kind of the way that these other people had recognized there's something happening with Abraham that is different than everybody else. God is blessing him. God is using him in a way that it becomes how do I say, it's an influence and effect upon the other people in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's again, I think you're exactly right to say God is doing these other things that are apart from even Abraham. God is appearing to other people and working in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
It shows something about his God's greatness, right?
Yeah. Well, that's always the thing for, you know, when I have this conversation is like, this shows that God's doing other things. And the story that we have is the story that we need of what God has done.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean this is the fullness of what God has been doing or has been
Exactly.
stirring in the world, or, you
Right.
know, that what else he is doing. And so,
Right.
but I just, for me, it's always that not only is it Melchizedek recognizes that God is the one who gave Abraham the victory, but that Melchizedek is labeled as a priest, which,
Priest.
we don't really get this priesthood narrative until Exodus. You know what I mean? Like, when we get Exodus and Leviticus, where we get to like, here's how the high priests operate, or the priests operate. And so it's just, it's fascinating to me to think about what the implications of this are.
Yeah. So a priest, is basically one who stands, between you and God, is the intercessor, right? And so this is what's going on here. So let me read a little bit further. Verse 4 says, just how great he was. Talking about Melchizedek. This is the Hebrew writer, chapter 7, verse 4. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. So he's going back to that story again. He starts talking about the Levites and how they're the ones who are able to collect the tenth. Look down in verse 9. I find this interesting. One might say that Levi, who collects the tenth, in other words, the descendant of Levites, right, the descendants of Levi, paid the tenth through Abraham, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. And this gets into kind of the idea of the seed, right?
Yeah,
the seed of Abraham. So, Levi hadn't even been born yet. And you could say there's a way in which even the priesthood is recognizing Melchizedek's greatness. So what you've got to think about rhetorically is what's the main point? Again, don't lose sight of the main point the Hebrew writer's trying to make. He's not trying to make some kind of esoteric argument. What he's trying to say is that, remember that Jesus can now be the priest in a way that is greater even than the Levitical priesthood. Okay. And so he's using this story, I think, to make that case. And again, it's in a strange kind of way. It seems like a strange way to us, but I think that's the main point he's making. So verses 11 through 18, and then I'll be done. This is the last mention of Melchizedek in the scripture. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? For when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. For it is clear that our Lord descended from Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priest. And what is said is even more clear. If another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who's become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. For it is declared, and here we have the quote from Psalm 110 again, you are a priest. I think the emphasis here is you are a priest forever. In the order of Melchizedek. He has eternal life, right? He is raised never to die again. The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless. And so I think, again, don't lose sight, however we understand this passage. You can do weird things with it if you want to. But however we understand this passage, don't lose sight of the main point, which is that Jesus is a superior kind of high priest, that his intercession between us and God is on the basis of his own sacrifice, as the Hebrew authors already said, that has been offered once and for all. That this is superior to the old way of doing things. Hebrew authors writing, chapter 6 makes this clear. He's writing for people who are in danger of apostasy back to a reliance upon the law. And he's basically saying, don't go back to that. This is a superior way. This is God's plan all along. And we can even see this in the law itself, using the book of Genesis, that there's another kind of priesthood that's not from the Levites, not based on the book of Leviticus, not based on genealogy, but is a priest forever. And so that's what I think he's doing, is he's using these Old Testament passages in a way to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of these things. Not in a way that then we read back, then Melchizedek is without mother, father, how do we understand that? So,
right. You have to get back to what's the point he's really trying to make here?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. I love this conversation about Melchizedek, because there's a lot of, I just love the idea that the God is working outside of, the narrative that we have. I mean, this character pops in, but that there are other things happening, that this is how God is working and pulling things together. So, and that, that Jesus is like in the line of Melchizedek. He is forever. and he is, he is greater than the law.
Yeah, one more thing. I want to go back because we were talking about the narrative first. Go back to the narrative now, and that contrast between the king of Salem and the king of Sodom, I think, is important as well. That there are other people out there who are, recognizing God's work in Abraham, but then there's the king of Sodom who's very cut off and who's worried more about his own position, his own, reputation than he is, anything about God or what God is doing. And again, that's going to show itself down the road when we see the complete destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah because of its wickedness. So,
yeah. So what's the so what of this, Brian? Is there a so what?
Don't do weird things with the Bible.
We haven't seen any of that recently.
I did think about doing some of those, but that's I don't know that I'm ready to do that. But I guess what I'm saying is that I think the scripture authors, for me, and I don't know about for you, there's some people who really like the weird kind of connections and that kind of thing. The connections I love, but don't. I read them.
Don't
in the way
make too much of them.
Read them in the way the authors intended. That's what I think we're trying to do, and don't forget the primary point. If the primary point becomes about these other weird kind of things, and I'm going to go ahead and say this, and I'll come back to another so what here in a minute. But I think I've had a lot of people ask me about the book of Enoch lately, and so I think we need to probably do I'm not ready to do that right now, but we need to do an episode on the book of Enoch. So my son was staying in an Airbnb just this past week, and he said, "Hey, Dad, there's some weird books here." And so he took a picture of a couple of them, and one was an author. I'm not going to name the name of it, but I looked him up, and essentially it's a flat earther who is reading the Bible through the book of Enoch. And,
yep.
And it's like, come on, guys, we can do better than this. The Bible is an amazing book. I mean, you guys know. Hopefully, you see that I love the Bible. I love to study it. I love everything about it. But the authors are doing something very particular, and we need to get ourselves in that mindset rather than trying to look for these weird ways to kind of read it. Mm-hmm. And again, I should be very careful because there's some very reliable people who would see this as some form of theophany that's going on. I just don't think Genesis. I don't think Moses in Genesis. I don't think the Hebrew writers making that point. I think they're making a much more. It's an important point, but it's something about Jesus' greatness and his superiority. So I guess the other so what, and it's one that's not as important for us these days, is that Jesus is completely sufficient. We don't need to go back to sacrifice. We don't need to go back to the Old Testament law. That he has fulfilled that, and he has given us freedom. To according to Philippians, according to Galatians, he has given us a freedom to live in light of his sacrifice and to be led by the Spirit in this way. So Melchizedek, obviously was led by God in some kind of way in what he could see. And I think that would maybe be what I would say is let's have our eyes opened. Let's try to see the way that God is leading us to be in the context of our world. Mm-hmm. You talked about the things that are going on. We've had a major computer outage. We've had a president's no longer running for re-election. We've had an assassination attempt upon a presidential candidate this past week. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I would say is that what our call always is, no matter what the situation, no matter what's going on, our call is to be faithful in responding to God's direction, God's guidance by his Spirit. Mm-hmm. And that's always going to be consistent with things like the fruit of the Spirit. Peace, joy, love, patience. These are the kind of things against which there is no law. Paul says in Galatians 6 or 5, wherever that is. And so I think, it's the same kind of thing. When Abraham is faced with his nephew. He counts on God's blessing to be the one who's able to release him. He reacts there with faith and not fear, right? And that's what I think. Fear is the opposite of faith. Being afraid of what the future holds, or being afraid of if this happens in our country, then I'm not afraid of that. Trusting in God means that whatever comes, he will be able to care for those who are his. It's not always going to be easy. Sometimes, like Lot was kidnapped, like Sodom was destroyed. Yeah. Not only is that easy, but God cares for those who are his. So.
Yeah. Well, Brian, thanks so much. This is a good one, to jump into this. And I'm sure you've maybe heard that name before if you're not the Melchizedek name, but to see those connections and to put them into context a little bit about what's going on here and what the Hebrew writer's trying to bring out. So really appreciate it.
Thanks so much to our listeners. We've got some new listeners we're very thankful for. We've had some support lately. So if you like what we're doing, continue to send support, share with others what we're doing. And
we got special guests coming here soon. Hopefully a very special guest coming on to talk about a book that he's already written, and he's also got a podcast himself, which is
really good podcast
himself. Is going to come and share a little bit with
values of this one, but
it's very good. If you're listening, it's very good. But anyway, so Brian, thanks so much. Yeah, if you're enjoying the podcast, we've got some books we've referenced the last couple times up on the website, thebiblebistro.com. So if you buy the book through the links on the website, we get cents, like 50 cents. So, but we do appreciate that. So a little bit comes back to us, but you can also check out other episodes on there, other resources we have available. So go to thebiblebistro.com. We've got we call book recommendations. You can see all kinds of stuff there. We're going to add some more to that here soon. And but if you're enjoying it, share the podcast.
If you have any response to what we said today, go ahead and send that too. If you have a disagreement, let us know. So.
Send that to Ryan. That's right. If you have disagreement, send it to me. All right, Brian. Well, thanks so much.
Right,
and we'll chat next Tuesday.
All right. See ya.
See you. Bye.